The Certainty Principle by David Light. Chapter 6, Sections 2, 3, and 4. Forevering. Forevering. Seeking to understand and embrace my accurate place and mandate beyond the domain of my own mortality. At 11, his death was a turning point in my life. I recall my grandfather, Earl Leicester, as a kind, confident, and courageous Santa Claus. He owned a small precision casting foundry in North Wales, Pennsylvania. As a boy, I'd sit a safe distance in a pile of casting sand, watching in awe as the great man ladled molten metal at 1400 degrees from a crucible into the casting forms. He seemed like a god in his big burn-proof boots, heavy khakis, leather apron, his face aglow in the light of the furnace. He painted a wide yellow circle on the concrete around the furnace, and I was always warned that it should never be crossed, especially by a kid. Inside the circle was Pappy's domain, a place of fire and danger. I was told to sit quietly during the pouring process, lest he became distracted. One time, the molten metal overflowed the form, encircling his boot, and it immediately burst into flame. He casually kicked the fire out, not missing a step, in a brave ballet of drawing off the liquid aluminum, carefully guiding it into small ports at the top of the casting form. My grandfather's wisdom came to me in his actions and mannerisms, not in his admonitions. I don't recall his words very well, but my images of him, hard at work from dawn until dinner, organizing his tools, his desk, tending his rose garden, or sitting in his rocking chair, calmly smoking his pipe while reading the paper, are indelible. Doubtless my Norman Rockwell images airbrushes the reality. I know, for example, that in the latter half of the 1950s, his business was struggling. My mother claimed that it was the cause that killed him, though my dad said it was a diet of scrapple and apple pie. But the strength and certainty that pervaded his person was cast into me as solid as a vein of steel. Despite the challenges of life, I was fortunate to have Pappy as an anchor to windward. Pappy's kind confidence stuck with me, elevating me through my life, despite my multitude of shortcomings. In turn, I made a point of passing on this sense to my son. During his speech at high school graduation, he spoke of the affirmations I had gleaned from my grandfather's behavior and constantly reinforced in my son. I have no doubt that Pap's influence will carry on to my grandson and his after that, his impact becoming a permanent component of the lineage. Considering the physics of the future, it is clearly impossible for outcomes to evolve otherwise. Section 6.3, Long-Term Temporal Perspective. Just as each atom of my body will recycle and reform forever after me, so every act that I choose to take integrates itself and is perpetuated in the future. What are the implications of implementing St. Jack's Law as a guide to my choices of action? First, an understanding of just how different it is. Quote, forever horizons, unquote, flies in the face of classical philosophies like the Stoics, like Seneca, who described treating time as a rare commodity, being mindful that death may await us around the next corner. My forever horizon compels me to see my actions in the context of their permanent impact. Though both philosophies focus the brain on personal responsibility for outcomes, foreverism sets my perspective on responsibility as permanent, my behavior a never-ending obligation. In effect, I never escape accountability for my actions. Brains operate in the instant. With a mechanical lack of operational perspective, my brain tends to default to pain avoidance, bouncing pinball-like from one situation to another, minimizing challenges to its status quo state, or pleasure-seeking, like a chronic lottery buyer focusing the next thrill or payoff to distract from boredom. Long-term temporal awareness is an act of will, a measure of maturity. Boredom results from my failure to establish enough time context, which is why boredom per se tends to be a malady of the young and immature. Growing up creates memories, requires me to build a temporal framework for my experiences so that I can make the sense of, if I so choose, the trajectory of my progress. This is the connect the dots perspective so common among uncommon leaders. Quote, "You can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future." Unquote. Steve Jobs, 2005. Quote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Unquote. Santayana, 1905. But such a perspective is only available to those who take themselves seriously enough to frame themselves in a historical context. Those who know their lives are important to the course of civilization. Lincoln, King, Alexander, Washington, Gandhi, and countless other important influencers framed their lives in the context of the great arc of the moral universe. It's a quote from Thomas Parker, 1850. Choosing an historic perspective within which I execute the tasks and deal with the problems provides the advantage of reasoning based on fundamental values rather than seeking momentary identity gratification. The forever horizon is the cognitive context of the evolved human being. Lacking it, I am imprisoned in my hyper-mortality of outcome dependence and addiction to identity. Achieving it, I free myself to do what I must do, abandoning the siren of identity bias that is a plague to the mortal brain. Section 6.4, Proximity and Temporal Perspective. Quote, "As size is to distance, so value is to time." Unquote. Plato, 380 BC. The proximity effect that Plato refers to here is the tendency of the human brain to demote future values, as purely captured in Plato's comparison of time and distance. Decreased proximity diminishes significance. A short-term temporal perspective diminishes perceived value in time. Future gains of significant value appear smaller, while present gains of little value may appear important. Michel et al., 1972. Ignoring the power of compound growth with respect to savings and investment is an often cited example of this brain effect. Temporal perspective is the time context within which I reason my course of action. Predominantly, short-term temporal perspective means the short-term gratification-based decisions will dominate. When presented with a cookie, I eat it, absent a thought of the consequences, because eating it reinforces a reactive pattern of behavior. Since instant gratification is an identity reinforcing because it figuratively and literally, in the case of too many cookies, makes more of me, in parentheses, as the modern pandemic of obesity so clearly demonstrates. Close parentheses. Similarly, emotion replaces action when I habitually focus on my immediate feelings as the priority. Rather than seeking an understanding of what my feelings signify, what are they pointing to, I seek the quickest path to gratification. Any gratification will do, and gastric fullness is an easy proxy for filling the void of ignorance. Now, sometimes eating a cookie is nothing more than just eating a cookie. I get that. But all patterns of instant gratification tend to reinforce short-term temporal behavior that is centered on feeling support and justify the emotional story defining my identity. Quote, "It's all about me," unquote. I don't need to dig any deeper for root cause and an appropriate course of action. The emotional me cookie is enough. Little perspective, no reasoning, accountability optional. Say I come across a person lying in the street, injured and crying out for help. Short-term temporal perspective prevents me from considering the consequences of the person's situation because I'm enthralled with my own immediate emotional response and the avoidance of the emotional discomfort of a deeper think into what I am experiencing and the rational actions dictated. This phenomenon is known as the bystander effect. Quote, I didn't want to get involved, unquote. Beginning at 3:15 a.m. on the morning of March 13th, 1964, Catherine Kitty Genovese was raped and murdered by Winston Moseley in an alley behind an apartment building in Queens, New York. Police interviews documented that over the course of the 30-minute attack, 37 people were either watching it happen or could hear Genovese screaming for help. Yet none took action. Minutes after the attack ended, a neighbor, Carl Ross, finally called a friend for advice on what to do. That friend then called another friend, who finally called police. Genovese died in an ambulance an hour after the attack had begun. The crime got little attention until a New York Times article, Gansberg, 1964, quoted a witness as stating, quote, I didn't want to get involved, unquote. That triggered public outrage, a group identity phenomenon, about urban apathy and subsequent studies into what was known as the bystander effect, Darley and Latane, 1968. Lacking a persistent framework of accountability, short-term temporal perspective promotes a fear response when confronted with the unfamiliar. Since accelerated change is the fundamental reality, STTP imprisons me in fear and inaction if I allow it to dominate. Short-term temporal perspective is the default state because my brain was born with a reactive amygdala. That's the lizard brain, the center of fight or flight response. Inherent activity tends to subvert the value of decision-making based on long-term temporal perspective. LTTP dominance establishes a pattern of reasoning on consequences and accountability. But since STTP is the default, LTTP requires cultivation to help it prevail. But how?